Hello, today I'll show you how to draw a pumpkin pie in Procreate. Then I'll show you how to slice the pie and add some finishing touches. I'm going to use a screen size canvas for this tutorial. I'll start by getting an orange color for the pumpkin pie filling. If you want the same color I used, you can tap Value at the bottom of the Colors menu and enter the hexadecimal that appears on the screen. It may be helpful to add this color and any color used throughout this tutorial to your color palette so you can access them easily. Now get the monoline brush from the calligraphy set and set the size of the brush. I'm going to make it about 20% and make the opacity 100%. Now I'm going to draw a large circle in the center of the canvas, and when I'm done I'll keep my Apple Pencil held down until it snaps into a more perfect shape. Then I'll tap Edit Shape at the top of the screen and choose the circle. Make sure your circle is complete with no gaps in the line, and then drag from the color swatch into the circle to fill it with the orange color. Now I'm going to tap on the arrow, and I'm going to move this circle into the center of the canvas, and I'll tap Uniform at the bottom of the screen and size it down a bit to make room for the crust. Now I'm going to tap on this layer and tap Rename and give it the name Filling. And then I'll create a new layer above it for the crust. And I'll just call this layer Crust. Now I'll get a color for the crust. And I'm going to use the circle as a guide to help me draw the crust. I'm just going to draw a wavy line and make sure that the ends connect. When you're done, swipe left on the crust layer and press Duplicate. Then tap on the arrow, and I'm going to make this a bit smaller and move it to form a thicker crust. Then tap on the duplicated crust and tap Merge Down, and then drag from the color swatch into the crust to fill it with the light beige color. Now if you need to, you can tap on the arrow and resize this a bit. The circle should be completely covered by the crust. Now I'm going to add some texture to the crust, so tap on the crust layer and press Select, and create a new layer above it. And I'm going to start with a lighter color, and then I'll get the Burnt Tree brush from the charcoal set. And set the size of the brush. I'm going to make it about 27% and the opacity 100%. And now you can just paint some light texture on the crust, and because it's selected, it will stay within the crust area. Now get a slightly darker color and add some dark texture. And then you can tap on the end on this layer and reduce the opacity a bit, so I'll make it about 87%. Now with the crust still selected, I'm going to create a new layer above the texture layer, and I'll get white for the color. And I'll get the Flicks brush from the spray paint set. I'm going to make the size about 8% and the opacity 100%. And now I'm going to add some sugar to the crust. Now I'll create a new layer and I'll get a brown color to add some shadows. And I'm going to use the soft airbrush from the airbrushing set. And I'll make the size about 8%. I'm going to add shadows on the lower parts of the wavy crust. When you're done, you can tap on the Adjustments button and tap Gaussian Blur, and then slide your finger or Apple Pencil across the screen to increase the blur. I'm going to make it about 22%. Then you can tap on the end on this layer and give it the Multiply Blend mode. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity a bit to maybe 83%. Now with the crust layer still selected, create a new layer, tap on the end and give it the Multiply Blend mode. Now tap on this layer and tap Fill Layer, and this should fill the selection with the brown color. Now move this layer underneath the crust layer. I want to blur this a bit to create a shadow around the crust, but I want the shadow to stay within the filling area. So I'm going to tap on the filling layer and press Select, and then tap on the shadow layer, and then tap on the Adjustments button and tap Gaussian Blur, and increase the blur to about 21%. Now I'm going to group all of these crust layers together, so tap on the top layer, and then swipe right on all of the layers underneath it except for the filling layer, and then tap Group. And then tap on this small arrow to collapse the group. And then you can tap on the group and rename it. I'm going to rename it Crust. And I'm going to turn this off for now. So with the filling layer still selected, create a new layer above it. Now I'm going to get a darker orange color, and I'll get the medium brush from the airbrushing set. Set the size of the brush. I'm going to make it about 8%, and I'll make the opacity 100%. And then I'll paint some darker orange around the edges of the circle. And when you're done, tap on the Adjustments button and tap Gaussian Blur, and then slide your finger Apple Pencil across the screen to increase the blur. I'll make it about 34%. Now create a new layer above it, and get a lighter orange color. And now paint a highlight on the pumpkin pie filling. And then tap on the Adjustments button and tap Gaussian Blur, and blur the highlight. I'll make it about 28%. And now let's add some texture on top of this circle. So create a new layer, tap on the end, and give it the multiply blend mode. Now get the original orange color. I'm going to use the carbon stick from the charcoal set. I'm going to make the size about 37% and the opacity 77%. Now paint some texture on the circle. When you're done, you can tap on the M on this layer and reduce the opacity a bit. Now I'm going to turn the crust layer back on to see how the pie looks. I think it's looking pretty good. I'm just going to add some whipped cream to the top. So create a new layer directly below the crust layer, and I'm going to get white for the color, and I'll use the monoline brush. Now I'll just draw some whipped cream, and then I'll fill it with white. Then I'll tap on the whipped cream layer and press select, and I'll create a new layer above it. I'll get a blue-gray color, and I'll get the soft airbrush from the airbrushing set. And now I'll paint some shading on the whipped cream. Now I'll add another layer, and I'll get a cinnamon color, and I'll get the Flicks brush from the spray paint set. Now I'll reduce the size of the brush a bit, and I'll paint some cinnamon on top of the whipped cream. And now I just need a shadow for this, so I'll create a new layer. I'll give it the multiply blend mode. I'll get the brown color, and then I'll tap on the layer and press fill layer. Now I'll move this layer below the whipped cream layer, and then I'll apply a Gaussian blur. Then I'll reduce the opacity of this layer a bit. Now let's slice the pie. So first I'm going to group all of these layers together by tapping on the crust group, swiping right on all of the layers below it, and then tapping group. Now I'll collapse this group, swipe left on it, and press duplicate. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the original group and give it the name pumpkin. Then I'll expand the duplicated group so I can see the layers. I want to remove the whipped cream layers from this group. So I'm going to tap on the cinnamon layer, and then I'll swipe right on all of the whipped cream layers below it, including the whipped cream shadow layer. When all of the whipped cream layers are selected, I'll move them above this group. Then I'll tap Group to group the whipped cream layers together, and I'll collapse this group. I'll tap on the duplicated pumpkin pie group and tap Flatten in the flyout menu. Now I'm going to rename the flattened pie Pumpkin Pie. And I'll rename the whipped cream group Whipped Cream. I'll tap on the flattened pumpkin pie layer, and then I'll turn off the visibility of the whipped cream group. I'm going to tap on the arrow and move my pie so I have more room to slice it. If you want to resize it, make sure Uniform is selected at the bottom of the screen and resize the pie. Now I'm going to slice the pie. Tap on the selection button and make sure Freehand is selected at the bottom of the screen. Now you can just draw a slice over the pie. I'm going to draw a slice in the bottom right corner of the pie. When you're done drawing it, tap on the arrow, and now you can move the slice away from the pie. I'm going to move the slice down and to the right. When you're done moving it, deselect the slice. Now I'm going to tap on the arrow again and move the slice and the pie into the center of the canvas. Now I want to add some depth to the pie. To do this, create a new layer and move it underneath the flattened pumpkin pie layer. I'm going to get the orange color, and I'll get the monoline brush from the calligraphy set. I'm going to make the size 100%. Now I'll draw some thick lines underneath the slice and underneath the pie. Because of the angle of the pie slice, I'm going to make the line thicker at the point and get gradually thinner as I move towards the crust. When you're done, create a new layer above this layer. I'm going to get the light orange color, and I'll reduce my brush size to about 29%. Now I'll draw some thinner lines between the top of the filling and the side of the filling. Now let's make the side and bottom of the crust. Create a new layer and get the dark crust color. Now draw a thin line underneath the side of the filling and draw the edge of the upper crust. I'm going to reduce my brush size before drawing the crust under the pie slice and make this line very thin. Okay, so now let's add some texture. Create a new layer above the crust layer that you just drew. Tap on this layer and tap Clipping Mask. I'm going to use the lightest crust color, and I'll use the Burnt Tree brush from the charcoal set. I'm going to make the size of the brush about 4%. Now I'll paint some texture on the edge of the upper crust. Because we're using a clipping mask, anything we paint will stay within the crust area. Now let's add some texture to the side of the filling. Create a new layer above the thick line layer. Tap on this layer and tap Clipping Mask. I'm going to use the light orange color, and I'll use the Artist Crayon brush from the sketching set. I'm going to make the brush size 14% and the opacity 100%. Now I'll paint some subtle texture on the side of the filling. If you want, you can tap on the end on this layer and reduce the opacity of the texture. Now tap on this layer and tap Merge Down. Then tap on the other texture layer and tap Merge Down. Now pinch all of these pie layers together to merge them, but don't include the whipped cream group or the original pie group as you merge the layers together. So now we can add a shadow around the pie. Tap on the flattened pumpkin pie layer and press Select. Create a new layer. I'm going to use black for the shadow color. Tap on the new layer and press Fill Layer to fill the selection with black. Then move this layer underneath the flattened pie layer. Now tap on the Adjustments button and apply a Gaussian blur to the shadow. I'll make it about 20%. Now I'm going to tap on the arrow and move the shadow down and to the right slightly. I think the shadow's too dark, so I'm going to tap on the N and reduce the opacity. I'll make it about 39%. I want to add some crumbs around this pie. So I'll create a new layer, and I'll move it underneath the pie shadow layer. I'll get the original pie crust color, and I'll get the Flicks brush from the spray paint set. I'm going to make the size 6%, and now I'll paint some crumbs around the slice and around the pie. I think the pie is looking pretty good. Let's just add the whipped cream to the top. So turn on the visibility of the whipped cream group, and expand the group so you can see the layers. I'm going to delete the whipped cream shadow and remake it to fit this pie. So swipe left on the whipped cream shadow layer and press Delete. Now tap on the top of this group and tap Flatten. Now tap on the arrow and you can move and resize the whipped cream. I'm going to size this down a bit and move it on top of the pie slice. Now let's add some more whipped cream to the pie. To do this, swipe left on the whipped cream layer and press Duplicate. Tap on the arrow and move the duplicated whipped cream onto the pie. I'm going to use the green node to rotate this a bit so it looks different. Now I'll repeat this process until I've covered the pie with whipped cream. When you're done positioning the whipped cream, pinch all of the whipped cream layers together to merge them. Now we'll add a shadow to the whipped cream just like we did earlier. Tap on the merged down whipped cream layer and press Select. Create a new layer and move it underneath the whipped cream layer. Get the brown for the color of the shadow. Now tap on the new layer and press Fill Layer. Then tap on the end on this layer and tap Multiply. Now apply a Gaussian blur to the shadow. I'll make mine about 17%. Now I'm going to tap on this arrow and move the shadow down and to the right slightly like we did with the pie shadow. And then I'll reduce the opacity of this shadow layer. The sliced pie is done. Now I'll show you how to add a few finishing touches such as a plate and a background. Create a new layer and move it below the pie crumbs layer, above the original pie group. I'm going to get a blue color for the plate, and I'll get the hard brush from the airbrushing set. Make the size 100% and make the opacity 100%. Then tap in the center of the canvas to place a circle there. I'm going to use my finger instead of my Apple Pencil, so the opacity will be 100%. Now tap on the arrow and resize the circle to fit the pie. It's okay if the circle goes outside the edges of the canvas. Now I'm going to create a new layer, and I'll get a slightly darker blue color. And now I'll tap on the canvas to place a circle, and then I'll tap on the arrow and move and resize this circle so it's slightly smaller than the first circle. Now I'll apply a Gaussian blur to this circle, and I'll make it about 15.8%. Now I'll create a new layer, and I'll get the original blue color. And I'll tap in the center of the canvas. This circle actually looks pretty good, so I'm not going to resize it. I'll just move it to the center of the plate. And now I'll apply a Gaussian blur to this circle. I'll make it about 26%. Now let's add some highlights to the edge of the plate. Create a new layer and get white for the color. I'm going to get the soft airbrush from the airbrushing set. I'll make the size about 8% and the opacity 100%. Now paint thin lines on the edge of the plate for highlights. Use the Apple Pencil pressure to vary the opacity of the lines. For extra sparkle, you can add a bit more white to the center of some of the lines. Now let's add a shadow to the plate. Tap on the original circle layer and press Select. Create a new layer and move it below the circle. I'm going to get black for the shadow color. Now tap on the new layer and tap Fill Layer to fill the selection with black. Then apply a Gaussian blur. I'll make it about 20%. And I'll tap on the arrow and move this shadow slightly down and to the right. And then I'll tap on the end on this layer and decrease the opacity to about 39%. Okay, so now to finish the pie, let's just add a background. Create a new layer and move it below the plate shadow layer. I'm going to use a texture brush to make something that looks like a tablecloth. I'll get the blue-gray whipped cream shading color, and I'll get the Victorian brush from the texture set. I'll make the size about 40% and the opacity 100%. Now I'll paint the background without lifting my Apple Pencil. When you're done, tap on the end on the texture layer and decrease the opacity a bit. Thank you for watching.